What if I told you in October of 2021, the day the A7 IV was released, that less than 2 years later, there would be a new camera that was 22% lighter and reduced in volume by 45%, with a whopping 61 megapixel Bionz XR sensor? Would you believe me? My favorite type of camera review is when we compare two cameras that are very close in spec and price and try to split their differences. The A7CR is an amazing camera, but so is the A7 IV. I had the opportunity to use both of them in a side-by-side setting where I could really make a contrast between the two of them. On what's different and what's similar. Time out. The big joke around here is that I keep on calling the A7CR the A7RC. I don't know, maybe it's because it's like a baby A7R5. Anyways, I'd be surprised if I make it through this entire video without calling it this A7RC. Here's the dilemma someone would face when deciding on which one of these two cameras they should purchase. The CR can shoot in 4K 60 with a 1.2 times crop, whereas the A7 IV crops in 1.5 times when you're shooting in 4K 60. But the A7 IV also has a dual card slot, which makes it a more professional camera. The A7CR can record in 16-bit RAW external, but the A7 IV has a full-size HDMI port. So as you can see, this is a very tough comparison. I've used the A7CR as my main A-cam for just under 3 weeks and shot 2 YouTube headshots along with street photography, nature stills, video, some action shots, portrait video, macro shots, product shots, and tested them both out extensively. I like to see the color differences between camera sensors and the lenses that you have on them, so for both tests of video and photo, I used these following lenses: the Tamron 28-75 f2.8, the Tamron 17-28 f2.8, and the Prime Zeiss 35mm f1.4. Today I'll be speaking about both the photography and the video capabilities of both cameras and showing you both video and photography comparisons. The A7CR and the A7 IV are very different hybrid cameras, but that makes each of them appealing to different users. In this video, I plan to show you the strengths and weaknesses, similarities and differences, and most importantly, the image quality out of both cameras. And that's what we're covering today on the Film Alliance. Before we get into the heart of the video, let me tell you what shooting with the A7CR was like while I had it. It was an absolute blast. It was basically a smaller, lighter version of the A7R5 without 8K for video, or that dual card slot, or the multi-angle LCD. But just so you know, the screen on the A7CR is fully articulating, just not that multi-angle display like we got with the A7R5. As we always do, let's dive into the similarities between both of these cameras before we get into the differences. Both are full-frame hybrid cameras, have the same 1.03 million dot fully articulating display, have EVFs constructed with magnesium alloy, take the same battery, can shoot in 422 10-bit, 4K up to 60. Both have focus breathing compensation, focus mapping, a mic port, a headphone port, HDMI, and USB-C. The same menu system, all the picture profiles including S-Cinetone, and both have intelligent hot shoes. Both cameras have sensor shift 5-axis stabilization and active steady shot, are weather sealed, and both have Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. The price of both cameras is fitting for what they offer, but the A7CR is more expensive than the A7 IV. The A7CR's release date is in August of 2023, and the A7 IV was released in October of 2021. But when looking at your budget, don't forget about the lens selection. If you only have enough funds to purchase APS-C lenses and you want to shoot in 4K 60, hold up on purchasing the A7CR. I'll explain later in the video. When we add memory and the battery, the A7CR weighs 515 grams and the A7 IV weighs 658 grams, which is a big difference, especially if you're looking for a camera that has good portability for travel with smaller form factor. The A7CR is the way to go. Theoretically, the bigger bodies would help with the overheating issue, but I did have the A7 IV overheat on me in 37 minutes in 4K 60 inside room temperature, and the A7CR went for over an hour and 40 minutes in 4K 60 on the same setting, and it didn't even overheat. I did turn auto power temp to high on both cameras, so clearly the technology in the smaller A7CR prevents overheating better. That could also be from the single card slot, I don't know. The hand grip on the A7CR is a bit wider and meatier than the A7 IV, but both hand grips extend about the same amount of distance. size. Although the hand grips are about the same size, I didn't have any issue with knowing which camera I was holding while I was shooting with both of them, like I did when I was shooting with the A7CR and A6700. If you're interested in that video, I'll leave it in the description. But either way, both grips were more than enough for me as far as a camera grip. As I always say, no matter how good the grip feels, try to budget for a cage which will give you more mounting points to add accessories and protect your camera in case you drop it. I have literally saved my camera bodies in the past because I had a cage on them, so I think of a cage as like a phone case. With that said, the A7CR does come with an extendable hand grip, which makes the ergonomics of the camera a lot easier to handle. There was more area for my hand to grab and hold onto, which makes me wish all of my cameras had this little bottom hand grip. The hand grip will also come with the A7CR, which it won't come with the A7C2. You'll have to buy that as an accessory, but it does have a quarter mount thread on the bottom along with the battery door so you can access the battery. I did remove that bottom grip when I was on a gimbal because it was messing with the balance. Both cameras have electronic viewfinders, but the A7CR has a 2.36 million dot EVF, and the brightness almost equal to the A7R5 with 0.70 times magnification, whereas the A7IV has 3.68 million dots inside of its EVF and 0.78 times magnification, which gives the A7IV a bit of an edge, but not by much to my eyes, at least while I was using it. Both cameras have a 1.03 million dot touch display. Both screens are 3-inch and fully articulating, which makes it really nice for people who film themselves like I'm doing right now. On the A7CR's display, you can swipe up and down to quick access the menu systems, but I prefer not to touch my display at all because I don't like to grease them up. Both cameras have headphone ports, mic ports, USB-C, and HDMI for external monitoring and recording. The HDMI on the A7CR is a micro HDMI, but can record externally in 16-bit RAW. The A7IV is a full-size HDMI, but you cannot record RAW externally, so although I prefer that larger HDMI on the A7IV for better connection and stability, I do love the fact that you can record 16-bit RAW externally on the A7CR. The A7CR has one card slot and the A7IV has a dual card slot, which means the A7IV has a huge advantage over the A7CR when not recording externally. When using the dual card slot, you can choose between more media storage by setting your camera to record to one card first and then flip to the other card, or you can record to both cards at the same time for redundancy. With that said, the A7IV also can take CF Express Type A, which I've never bought because they're too expensive for me, but they are super reliable. Both cameras have that front dial, which I use for aperture, and you can use the other dials for shutter speed and ISO, all from the outside of the camera without having to jump into the menu system or the function menu. I set both cameras up the same as best as I could so I could be efficient while I was out filming with both of them. I had to make sure I was using the same picture profiles, I had all the same frame rates and resolutions, I was dialed in, had the same lenses, and made sure that I was exposing the same on both cameras so that you could have a better reference. So I had to make sure the customization on the bodies of the camera were the same so I could have a better and easier, faster, more efficient workflow. The A7CR does have less buttons and dials than the A7IV, which means you cannot customize it as much. This may be a perk to those of you who like less buttons and dials on the outside and prefer a more slick and slimline look, but that's totally up to you. I prefer more buttons and dials because I feel like that puts me into more control with quick reaction times to the changing lighting environment. The A7IV has 3 custom buttons, C1, 2, and 3, and the A7CR only has 1. Both cameras also have that mode dial where you can quickly switch between videos and photos and S&Q mode without having to dive into your menu system of your camera. I know these are similarities, but they are different from other Sony cameras, so I thought they were worth mentioning. The A7IV has an autofocus joystick where you can really hone in on what you want your camera to focus on, whereas the A7CR does not. The advertised dynamic range out of the A7CR is 15 stops, and I found information all over the place when it came to the A7IV, but it seemed like a general consensus was around 11-ish to 12-ish stops of dynamic range. Rather than depend on the specs, let's just look at the side-by-side comparisons, pay attention to the frame rate and the resolution, and the picture profile. I shot in both S-Log3, Cine 2, and with no picture profile on at all. I did some low-key grading in post, really trying to minimize any highlights, blowouts, or squashing any of the shadows. But I didn't spend more than 10 seconds on each clip so you could have the best possible reference. The A7CR has 693 phase detection autofocus points that cover 79% of the image area, whereas the A7IV has 759 autofocus points, which covers approximately 93% of the image area. However, when you throw the A7CR into Super 35, it covers 100% of the image area, which is pretty remarkable. A big advantage the A7CR has over the A7IV is the AI processing chip, which provides the A7CR with better autofocusing systems for a wider variety of subjects. They both have real-time eye autofocus for humans, animals, and birds, for photo and video, but the A7CR pushes that a bit with trains, planes, and insects. Speaking about the new AI processing chip in the A7CR, you get all of those features like auto reframing, a video timer, and internal time-lapse. With the A7IV, you do have to do time-lapse through the interval shooting function within the menu system. Then you have to take those photos into post-production and seam them together to make your own video time-lapse. So the internal time-lapse function inside of the A7CR is very helpful. The big difference in this comparison is the huge 61 megapixel sensor we get out of the A7CR compared to the 33 megapixel we get with the A7IV. Not that we should ever shoot the crop, but it's really nice being able to crop your image to less than 5% of your image and still see a ton of detail. The A7CR's burst rate is 8 frames per second with the mechanical shutter and 7 frames per second with the electronic shutter. And the A7IV has a 10 frames per second burst rate. It's not that much of a difference, but it is a difference in something that we have to note. You can get about 520 stills when you're using the LCD on a full battery with the A7CR, and you get about 580 shots using the LCD on the A7IV. If you're using the EVF, it wouldn't be much less than that, but for some reason the EVFs take more charge, and so you don't get as much battery life when you're using your EVF. Don't ask me why. Maybe that's due to their brightness. If you know why this is, please let me know. I would be very interested. Also, both cameras get about 2 hours worth of video on a single battery. Both cameras can shoot in JPEG and RAW. The A7CR can shoot in pixel shift multi-shooting mode, and if you're curious as to what that is, it shoots a 16 image composite, giving you a 241 megapixel file that you can use for landscapes or other things, even if there's things moving in the frame, because the technology in the A7CR removes and combines pixels to formulate the image. But at this point in time, the A7CR does not do that in camera. You have to take those 16 images to an image editing app like Sony's imaging app, or wait for Photoshop to develop the profile for this particular camera, and then actually seam it together in post, just like you would with interval shooting on the A7IV for time-lapse. Even though this seems like an extra step, it truly is amazing to have a 241 megapixel photo that you can really crop in on whatever you're shooting, especially for landscapes. Both cameras have sensor shift 5-axis stabilization and active steady shot, but the A7CR has 7 steps or stops of stabilization, where the A7IV only has 5.5. It doesn't seem like much, but it does make a big difference, especially when shooting in 4K 60 or for photography, or if you're walking with the camera. The reason I say 4K 60, especially with the A7IV, is because you already get that 1.5 times crop, which is going to make your images look a little bit more shaky anyways. The AI processing chip inside of the A7CR also improves communication between the body of the camera and the lens, which gives the shot a more stable framing with less shake. Both cameras record gyro data inside of the camera, which you can put through Sony's Catalyst Browse software and smooth out your footage for even more smoother footage. I don't use Catalyst Browse because it's an extra step in my workflow, and if it's in your budget, I would recommend just picking up a gimbal instead and just get the shots right in camera. Both cameras have electronic shutter, which produces rolling shutter in both video and stills. In fact, that is one reason why I would use Catalyst Browse, to remove that rolling shutter the electronic shutter produces while you're filming video. I couldn't really tell the difference between both cameras, but once I threw both of them into APS-C mode or 4K 60 on the A7IV, rolling shutter improved drastically. If you're a vlogger, you could go with either of these cameras, but the A7CR stabilization will beat out the A7IV if you plan on walking and vlogging holding the camera at arm's length. Also, a full frame setup would be heavier and make the entire user experience not that enjoyable, rather than using APS-C lenses. You could get an ultra-wide APS-C lens and put it on either of these cameras, which would make vlogging over a longer period of time more manageable to your shoulder. But if you purchase an ultra-wide APS-C lens for the A7CR, you wouldn't be able to shoot in 4K 60. If you vlog or plan to vlog, please let me know your camera and lens selection, because I'd be very interested to know. Both cameras have all the picture profiles plus S-Cinetone, but the A7CR has the ability to upload custom LUTs. I use this function with the FX30 whenever I'm shooting an S-Log3, and it makes it super easy to expose everything right in camera rather than guessing what my exposures should be. If you're shooting in something like S-Log3, you can also turn on Gamma Display Assist, which applies a color correction to the log image, which is a workaround to not being able to upload LUTs to the A7IV like you can with the A7CR. Also, I find that when I'm shooting an S-Log3, the white balance is key. If you can just custom white balance, you'll be so much better off when you're trying to color grade in post. But you don't always have to use S-Log3. Right now, my picture profile is off on my A7S III, and the picture profile is off on the A6700, which is my B cam. But either way, I custom white balanced both cameras because I find that custom white balancing really does make your videos look so much more realistic than the auto white balance inside of the cameras. But with that being said, the A7CR has something called no shock white balance or something like that, and I was noticing as I was shooting in auto white balance, it was so much better off than any other camera that I compared it to while I had it. It's probably just something that they added to the technology of the camera, and again, Sony is just competing with themselves. The CR can shoot in 4K 60 with a 1.2 times crop, and when you throw it into APS-C mode, it can only shoot up to 30 frames per second. So if you want to use APS-C lenses for video with the A7CR, you won't be able to shoot in 4K 60, whereas the A7IV gets that 1.5 times crop, but at least you can shoot with APS-C lenses in 4K 60 with the A7IV. If you wanted a camera that could shoot in 4K 60 with full-frame lenses, then you would want to go with the A7CR. If you wanted a camera that could shoot in 4K 60 with APS-C lenses in crop mode, then you would want to go with the A7IV. When you shoot in APS-C mode on the A7CR, you get 6.2K oversampling and full pixel readout. But the A7IV can also shoot in 4K video oversampled from 7K with full pixel readout. But you be the judge on which image you think looks better between the A7CR Super 35 mode compared to the A7IV while shooting in 24 frames per second. The A7IV effectively frames like an APS-C camera in 4K 60. If you bought the A7IV only to shoot in 4K 60, you probably would just want to buy some APS-C lenses for it. If you really want to shoot in 60 frames per second in 4K with full frame camera, then go with the A7CR. APS-C crop mode on both cameras gives you a variety of framing choices, but also the options of using APS-C lenses designed for APS-C cameras without having any vignetting issue. The A7CR has a newly designed built-in microphone with 2 holes on the front and on the top, which would theoretically have better sounding native audio than the A7IV. But you can be the judge on which one sounds better listening to the sound straight out of camera. Alright, so here we are doing a vlog test and an audio test at the same time with the A7CR. Right now I have the Tamron 28-75 f2.8 on the end of the camera. My shutter speed's 1/50, I'm at f2.8, and my ISO is 100. I did turn stabilization off, so it might be a little jittery in the background, but I'm not actually walking, I'm just standing still. Really, we're just doing an audio test. So here we got the same exact test. I got the Sony A7IV with the Tamron 28-75 f2.8 lens on it. The lens is all the way back to 28 millimeters. I have 1/50 for my shutter speed, f2.8, and my ISO is 100. And I'm also using no picture profiles for either of these shots. Both cameras' ISO sensitivity goes up to 102,400, so the low light performance will be about the same. If you're shooting in 4K 60, then the A7CR is the winner because it doesn't crop in like the A7IV. When I was shooting all the low light shots and at the aquarium, I went head to head in full frame at 4K 24 and they performed about the same. If at all possible, I recommend you asking yourself, what are you using these cameras for? You can rent them from lens rentals and try them out yourself, get them in your hands and see how you operate with both cameras as far as dials and buttons and the usability. But it really comes down to asking yourself these questions before you purchase either of these cameras. Would you rather have 16-bit RAW recording or a full-size HDMI? Would you rather have a 61 megapixel sensor for better pictures or better image quality in video in APS-C mode? Would you rather have the AI functionality and everything that it comes with, or the 759 autofocus points in full frame? Would you rather have pixel shift multi-shooting or a faster burst rate? If you can answer those questions, then you will be able to figure out which camera is right for you. As for me, I would prefer the newer A7CR or A7RC with full frame 4K 60, no crop. But if I was on a budget, I could only afford APS-C lenses, then I would go with the A7IV all day long. Thanks for watching this video. I'm Joe with the Film Lines, and until the next one, have a nice week.